Welcome. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our second in a series of webinars commemorating the 50th anniversary of Hurricane Agnes. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on our Agnes 50th website after our session. So I hope that the Bill Withers song really got you in a 1970s mood. As Mike Builder noted in the chat, Lean on Me topped the charts in 1972. It stayed on Billboard's top 100 for 3 weeks following Agnes. And while not written about the hurricane, it certainly had a message that I think likely resonated with all of the survivors of Agnes. My name is Maggie Dunn. I'm going to host our webinar today. I am the outreach coordinator for FEMA Region 3's Mitigation Division out of our Philadelphia office. I have asked folks to introduce themselves in the chat, and I see that we have a lively group here, so thank you. Please continue to drop your name and what you work on here in the chat. I hope that we can continue that throughout this entire session. This presentation is part of a much larger effort by the Silver Jackets. The Silver Jackets is a multi-agency flood risk management team, and Hurricane Agnes is being commemorated by those teams from Maryland, New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. And our goal here is to call to mind the stories of Agnes, recognize the devastation the storm caused, and also really use this moment to plan for the future. Hurricane Agnes made landfall as a Category 1 storm and caused significant and widespread damage throughout the mid-Atlantic. Rainfall from Agnes really caused catastrophic inland flooding, the geographic scale of which we have not seen in decades. Tragically, 128 people lost their lives across 8 states, and many, many people were forced to evacuate, over 300,000 across the country, including 220,000 in Pennsylvania alone. So really an historic event, a very difficult event, and something that we have learned from already, and to this day continue to learn from. I'm joined today by several panelists. So we have Stacy Underwood, the Silver Jackets coordinator from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Baltimore District, Dusty Brocious and Crystal Newman, both in our Hazard Mitigation Assistance branch here in FEMA Region 3. And we have Ken Roberts, the Code Compliance Administrator from Danville Borough in Pennsylvania, which was significantly impacted by Agnes. We are going to have a series of short presentations focused on the evolution of our mitigation programs. And I encourage folks to put questions or comments in the chat throughout the session, and we'll try to address them as they come up. So I'll take a break in between each presentation so that we can kind of answer your questions or get to your comments in a timely manner. We also have time at the end for discussion. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stacy with the Army Corps of Engineers to kick us off. Stacy, if you'd like to share your slides directly.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Stacy Underwood. I'm with the Army Corps of Engineers in Baltimore. I am the Silver Jackets coordinator. I know Maggie mentioned what Silver Jackets was. I help lead this interagency Silver Jackets teams in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and the District of Columbia, and I support the Virginia, New York, and West Virginia teams. So today I'm going to talk a bit about Agnes and the progression of flood mitigation. Some flood mitigation projects that were in place before that helped reduce the flood risk, and then what's been happening in the last 50 years. And I'll talk basically kind of in general in this area, and then a little bit about, what the Corps has been doing in the area. So just so you know what Baltimore District, what areas that covers, it's the entire Susquehanna River Basin, the watershed headwaters up in New York, down to the Chesapeake Bay, and then also the Potomac River watershed. So I will be talking about some projects in our civil works boundary, but also some that are outside and some that are not correlated. So long before Agnes, the Corps was working to reduce flood risk in the area, in the Mid-Atlantic Northeast area. This same area actually had a major flood in March 1936. It was heavy rainfall on top of snow melt, quite devastating. And that really, that then, caused Congress to to pass the National Flood Control Act of 1936. And that really propelled the Corps of Engineers into flood risk management and spurred many Corps projects after that. So in the 1930s to 1950s, a number of dams were built, flood wall levee systems were built by the Corps, but also by states and local municipalities. And a number of these did reduce flood risk during Agnes. One of those projects is in Mount Morris Dam in Livingston County, New York. It was constructed in 1952 by the Corps of Engineers. The Buffalo District oversees that. You can see the pictures there. It's a 248-foot high concrete dam, and it reduces flood risk to the entire metropolitan area of Rochester, New York. So it really reduces flood risk to a large population. And as you can see, during Agnes, the reservoir was completely full. That picture there on the bottom shows it when it was at 96% capacity. So you can just tell that really, reduced flood risk to areas downstream, the Genesee River Basin. It really prevented a major disaster. And it's estimated that that dam has prevented about $3.9 billion in damages since its completion. Another successful story during Agnes is the Sunbury flood wall project in Sunbury, Pennsylvania. And I realize there's a few folks, it looks like on the call, that probably know some of these projects even better than I do. So feel free to chime in with any information that you have. But this is a project that the Corps built in 1951. The Corps built it. The city of Sunbury operates and maintains it. It includes thousands of feet of levee and flood wall. And it was designed to reduce flooding from an event similar to the March 1936 event. And as you can see in the photos during Agnes, it reduced damages significantly to that city. You can see on the upper left there is the flood wall, and the river came within inches of overtopping. So Sunbury was very lucky during that flood, as opposed to some other communities. And as you can see, the picture there, "We love you all," that was that showed the appreciation of the citizens of Sunbury during Agnes, that they spray painted that on there. Not that I can condone the spray painting, and I must say this area also, with Tropical Storm Lee in 2011, the wall also prevented water from entering the community. And during 2011, they actually put it in chalk. They wrote, we love you all again," but it was in chalk, a little more environmentally friendly. So then in the 1960s, in the Susquehanna River Basin, at least, new priorities started to come about. Folks were concerned about environmental protection, water supply, water quality. Dams became more difficult to construct, mostly due to very high cost and significant environmental impacts. So really, flood risk management kind of, reduced as a priority, and funding, at least for the core projects, really started to lag at that time. And then, of course, June 1972, Agnes hit. As Maggie mentioned, it was the most destructive storm in American history at the time. Although, a number of dams and levees, as you saw, reduced flood damage significantly, some did not. And of course, as typical, after a major flood event, flood mitigation projects again became a priority, and funds started to flow for new projects. So one I wanted to mention was the Wyoming Valley Levee System. The Corps actually built this back in the 1940s and 1950s. The upper left picture shows that, I think back in 1930, sometime in the 1930s, or I'm sorry, in the 1940s. And it's a large project, 15 miles of levees and flood walls, and it has 4 different segments reducing flood risk to a number of different communities around the Wilkes-Barre vicinity. And unfortunately, during Agnes, the flood wall and levees were overtopped by up to 5 feet. It just shows you how big Agnes was. And it was just devastating to the communities, $2.8 billion in damages alone in this region. And I must say, obviously, it was devastating to the communities. And I recently just interviewed the Corps' operations head, who said he remembers the day that he had to come in and tell the Corps engineers that the levees were going to overtop, and they were just devastated. And it just shows you that, you know, levees can only prevent flooding up to a certain height. They can be overtopped. The levees did not fail; they were just overtopped because a larger flood event occurred. So, and I do want to mention, like, Tropical Storm Lee. So this was then raised. Studies started, and a project to raise those levees was completed in 2003. Again, 30 years later, it shows how difficult and challenging these projects are to design and construct. But in Tropical Storm Lee, the levees did protect the communities, and it was not overtopped. So that was a huge success. Also, after Agnes, you know, Richmond, city of Richmond flooded intensely. You can see on the upper left there, that's Route 95 looking north, major flooding. So the Corps worked with the city of Richmond, constructed a project there. It was completed in 1994. The city maintains and operates it. And it basically, you know, helps reduce flood risk from the James River. And another project that was lagging during Agnes is the Tioga Hammond's lakes and dams up in in Pennsylvania. It actually reduces flood risk to parts of New York and parts of Pennsylvania. But this project was actually authorized for the Corps in 1958, but funding was slow in coming. The project was behind. And of course, after Agnes came, funding flowed, and this was actually completed in 1978. So in the late 60s and 70s, you can see, you know, various legislation passed that impacted floodplains and flood risk management. You had the National Flood Insurance Program, 1968, National Environmental Policy Act, 1969, and the Floodplain Management Executive Order in 1978. So at this point, you know, communities started to regulate land use and building codes. Although the flood reduction benefits of, you know, large structural projects like dams and levees were understood, the impact of, you know, to the environment was a concern. Projects now had to assess and reduce and mitigate environmental impacts. So this was started, but, you know, this says late 60s, 70s, but these were, you know, slow starting. They were all, you know, new legislation had to be figured out, implementation, technical assistance, guidelines, so forth. And not all, like, communities participated in the NFIP. I know the Pennsylvania Floodplain Management Act in 1978. The state then required all communities in the floodplain had to participate in the NFIP. So it varied community to community. Then in the 1980s and 90s, the nation, you know, really started to better understand and promote the benefits of natural floodplains. You know, large structural solutions like levees and dams, you know, should not be the only, you know, flood risk management measure looked at. Other, what the Corps of Engineers calls non-structural solutions that, you know, don't change the flow of water started to be considered. So the Corps calls structural, like levees and dams and flood walls. What we call non-structural are things that do not change where the water goes. It basically just reduces the consequences. So that would be like buying out buildings, restoring the floodplain, elevating and flood-proofing buildings, purchasing flood insurance, flood mapping, and so forth. And in 1985, the Corps actually started the National Non-Structural Committee. That was formed, and it was to help to provide, you know, some guidance on these non-structural activities. But they've taken a while. I mean, I think, you know, over decades, people are getting more and more used to these. And then in the 2000s, really in the last 20 years, there's been a general movement towards more nature-based solutions. And I want to kind of emphasize when possible. You know, I know some of these projects might not be as effective as structural solutions, but, you know, there's still instances, I think, where structural solutions like flood walls and levees are appropriate, but there are a number of communities that are really embracing these acquisitions and restoring the floodplain to make space for the water. Rather than fighting the water, work with the water. And also, you know, communities are looking for solutions with multiple benefits in addition to flood risk management. You know, they also want to see recreational trails and parks and environmental enhancements and so forth. So that's really something that's moving, that folks are really focusing on these days. And really, I think many successful projects utilize a number of these different techniques, some structural, some non-structural, some nature-based. And I wanted to mention one successful, I think, acquisition and floodplain repurpose project has been ongoing in Lewisburg Borough. Pennsylvania since Agnes. Initially, this was a section of downtown. It was commercial and industrial. And after Agnes, the borough acquired and demolished several buildings in the 70s and 80s. But then more recently, they used Fema grants in the 2000s, 2010s to acquire 16 more. And what they're doing is restoring a portion of the floodplain in Bull Run. They're putting in some restrooms, some park, a rail trail, making it a nice recreational area with some unique playgrounds on the site. And really this will help, expand the capacity of the floodplain, and to restore it to more natural condition. And you can see there's a lot of different agencies involved in this. And then another example of a multi-purpose project is the Carroll Creek Park in the city of Frederick, Maryland. They were flooded in 1972, again in 1978. And so they decided they wanted to restore the economic vitality of the historic commercial district. So they developed an innovative mixed-use urban park. Basically, the park, rests on these massive box culverts that can hold the size of a bus that take some of the flow, but they still have some going above it, and they have a lot of benefits: flood risk management, historic preservation, economic development, and so forth, recreation. And just a few more slides here to finish up. So we talked about Agnes was a major riverine flood. I know riverine and coastal floods are things that we're used to dealing with, and we need to continue to deal with climate change. But more recently, there's been a big focus on these high intensity, short duration rain storms, such as Ellicott City in Maryland, 2016 and 2018. They had like 6.5 inches of rain in 3 hours. And then the bottom picture is District of Columbia in September 2020. So just these heavy rains that are causing main problems. And then lastly, really to finish up, really just want to say, flood risk management is complex. It's challenging. There's no easy solution, unfortunately. It really is a shared responsibility between all the different levels of government. As you can see here, it's going to take all the tools in the toolbox, things like outreach and natural floodplain storage, maybe some structural, maybe some non-structural, change in building codes, zoning, insurance, all these things to try to drive down that risk. But I am happy to see a lot of organizations working together, looking holistically, more comprehensively going forward to try to reduce their flood risk. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Stacy. I was looking through the introductions a little bit, and we really do have a diverse group of, a lot of local practitioners, state agencies, and federal agencies on here. And so I think it speaks to that last slide of how we all need to work together. And I think that I'm hoping at the end in our discussion, we can get to some of the points that you raised that has really started since kind of the early 70s, the late 60s, right around the time of Agnes, of how do we manage flooding, know the purpose of structural solutions, and know where we want to use restore more of the natural floodplain and do some of our watershed approach, as well as with an eye to how do we preserve some of our historic structures. All of these things it's a real challenge. And so I think that understanding the history of Agnes and the impact that those structural solutions did have in preserving people's properties, helping to save lives, is really critical to keep in mind as we move forward. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dusty Brocious and Crystal Newman.
Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Dustin Brocious. I am the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Branch Chief at FEMA Region 3. So I really have to thank Stacy. She's really set up my presentation really well in talking about many of the projects, giving examples of many of the projects that have been executed throughout the region in partnership with local, state, and federal levels of government. And some of them, not all of them, but some of them FEMA has made an investment in. And since Agnes and currently, most of those investments are made through the hazard mitigation assistance programs. So I'm just going to briefly, if you would, Andrea, just advance to the next slide. Thank you. I'm just going to give a really brief overview of our HMA, or Hazard Mitigation Assistance Programs, but beginning with a definition. So FEMA identifies or defines hazard mitigation as a sustainable action that reduces or eliminates long-term risk, but for people first, but certainly property. There is a focus on reducing vulnerabilities for communities to be able to build resilience following a disaster, essentially identifying your risks and meeting resolutions to those risks so that a community can actually recover faster. Certainly, we have found in the more recent decades faster recovery from events like similar to Agnes in 1972. And certainly looking at communities to expand their community resilience without having to rely on external financial assistance. But meeting those risks before. You can certainly go ahead, Andrea. I am moving on to the next slide. So we have 3 programs offered under the Hazard Mitigation Grant or under the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program. The first being the HMGP, or the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, that we more commonly call our disaster program, because that funding is only made available following a presidentially declared disaster. But we also have 2 annually appropriated non-disaster programs. First and foremost being the BRIC program. BRIC is still relatively new. It's only in its 3rd year of offering this year. It replaced our previous program that had been around for a few decades, the pre-disaster mitigation program, but essentially it makes funding available to do similar types of risk reducing work, but not having to wait until there's actually a disaster to do some of that work in advance of there being an event that would cause widespread damage similar to what was experienced following Agnes. And then finally, we have our Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, and FMA really focuses on reducing the burden to the National Flood Insurance Program and focusing on mitigating both repetitive NFIP designated repetitive loss structures or severe repetitive loss, which whether, depending on what your structure may be considered, depends on the volume of claims that you made against your flood insurance in a given period. If you would, Andrea, the next slide. So I just wanted to share some of the more common projects that are funded with the HMA programs. Again, Stacy touched on many of these. First being any combination of acquisition of properties, elevation of properties to get their first floor elevation above the base flood elevation, or the reconstruction in a different area from where a structure might be located. Also, soil stabilization projects, generator installation, stormwater management projects, the historically structural projects that Stacy mentioned, and definitely a renewed emphasis on nature-based infrastructure. And nature-based can come in many different formats. There are lots of new innovations through the development of natural retention basins and things like that to divert floodwaters, but really the acquisition and demolition of structures within the floodplain is really truly in and of itself a nature-based solution. There just are always other factors to consider, like the impacts to local communities, tax bases, things of that nature. It certainly does provide a resolution to a risk of structural flooding, but it's not always the best solution. So we look at others. And then just moving down the list under our other categories like planning activities, we also have an opportunity where we can use 5% of the funding available following a disaster to conduct outreach or to provide warning and notification systems, or early warning systems. And then more commonly or more popular in the last 5 years or so has really focused on providing more technical assistance and opportunities to scope out projects that can help with a community's planning for the future, but also makes needed technical assistance available that might exceed a community's capacity to even look for utilizing some of the funding that we have available, both before a disaster and after a disaster. If you would, Andrea, the next slide. So just a general a general acknowledgement that we always advocate planning and making decisions for funding investments, not in a vacuum, but to take the consideration of all of your risks that any one community or state might be susceptible to, and have that be the basis for where you make an investment, again, either following funding available for a disaster or even prior to a disaster. So we say that, good projects always start with good planning. FEMA does have a requirement to be eligible for HMA funding that your local community and both your state have a hazard mitigation plan in place prior to being eligible for funding. If you would, Andrea, the next slide. So I just wanted to give a real brief overview of and I like the term that Maggie used in the beginning, the evolution of our mitigation actions in Region 3, but really FEMA throughout the nation. So historically, funding, again, was only made available post a disaster, a presidentially declared disaster, grant funds associated with the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. And the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program only came into existence through the Robert T. Stafford Act of 1988, which does identify or codify our funding opportunities for FEMA for meeting the recovery from a disaster. And in 1988, the HMGP program to address risks and mitigate them first became available. In Region 3, there was some small scale application of the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program between the years of around 1993 and 1995. And then following a region-wide flooding event in 1996, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, we saw our real first scale appreciation of how we can build resiliency through the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which really bore our non-disaster programs as well. So since that time, since 1988, and more accurately, the early 90s, FEMA has made a $114 million investment through the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program for the sole purpose of reducing potential risks. Through our non-disaster programs, we had made about a $30 million investment in projects. I will just say that in the last 2 years since 2020 and really fiscal year 2021 has been a bit of a game changer in that our funding and our opportunity to expand resiliency, again, not just in the Region 3 states, but in FEMA nationwide, has expanded greatly. To say it's expanded actually minimizes what has occurred. Currently in Region 3, we are on the docket to make an additional $65 million in projected awards just over the rest of fiscal year 22 and into fiscal year 23. And due to the response to the COVID pandemic, we have currently $250 million available among our 6 states for, again, growing capacity, but really growing resiliency within the Region 3 states. So that we currently have a total of $274 million available to award. And all of our states are diligently working with their local communities to submit applications to take advantage of that funding. But what we have identified specifically is that it truly is the 200% increase of what we have invested in the past, and that past is really over 30 of the last 50 years since Agnes was experienced. We are meeting that challenge at FEMA, as well as our states are meeting that challenge in growing our teams. Our HMA branch in the last 2 years has tripled in size, and we're continuing to grow in order to meet the challenge challenge of expanding resiliency and taking advantage of the funding that has been available, mainly because of new and recent legislation on the part of the administration and also the budget of this year. If you would, Andrea, the next slide. So one of the tools that we have developed recently to help us in looking at where we have made significant investments, really since Agnes, is a screenshot that I'm showing you of FEMA Region 3's Hazard Mitigation Assistance Grants Project Viewer. Essentially, it is a web-based tool where you can find where mitigation projects by categories, as you see there, it'll show you acquisition relocations versus acquisitions of vacant lots, by project type, really anywhere within Region 3 states. And I'm certain we'll be sharing these slides and you will have that that host point and where to find this tool. But it is available for communities' use in planning for HMA type projects. Andrea, the next slide. When you go further, and unfortunately we just had a time constraint that we couldn't show you the live product, but as you would move through it, you will find, you know, basically a series of maps, digitized online vibrant maps that will show you clusters of where project investments have been made over the course of our HMA programs. What you're looking at right there specifically is Montour County, Pennsylvania. And we chose Montour County because as coming up, you'll see that we're case studying or highlighting Danville Borough in Montour County, Pennsylvania, and its effects from received from Hurricane Agnes, Tropical Storm Agnes, but also you know, what they are doing currently to meet their risks. If you would, the next slide. So I mentioned that we'll be highlighting Danville Borough for truly a purpose. I am a lifelong resident of central Pennsylvania, first, you know, the Northumberland County area, which is alongside of the Susquehanna River and was impacted. And I really enjoyed Stacy's presentation, and especially that shot of the from Sunbury where some very overzealous residents identified the happiness that they had the flood wall in place in 1972. And just to say that, having grown up in that area, that message was there well into the 80s. I vividly have memories of my childhood of passing that section of Front Street in Sunbury and seeing that that we love our, I guess some people would call it graffiti, but really I think it was more gratitude that the flood wall was in existence. But not far from Sunbury, just north of it is Danville, Pennsylvania, that also, you know, did not have a flood wall in place at the time, and was greatly impacted by Tropical Storm Agnes and its remnants. And I have a personal story to share about my family's experience in and around Danville. If you would please, Andrea, the next slide. So we've talked a lot about the risks and identifying them and planning for your risks and how to address them. And as I mentioned earlier, the HMA program does put a focus on lives, not just property. And lives, you will notice, is always mentioned first. So there's always a human impact to and anyone who has been through an event similar to Agnes. So again, because I grew up in central Pennsylvania, my family are natives of that area. Everyone does have a story. I'm just going to briefly share mine. So you are looking at a picture of me from 1972. And I just want to caveat, I am not 50 yet, but a little later in 1972 and a little later I was born, and a little later this year I will be turning 50. But then I also shared a picture of about a year later in 1973, hopefully as the recovery was well underway. But in essence, or essentially, my mother, whose name was Doris, she was in Danville, Pennsylvania during June of 1972, while it was actively flooding. She was only there for one reason, and that's because she was a patient at the Geisinger Medical Center at that time, because about a month prior to the flood occurring, she was diagnosed with a damaging tear. I want to get it right. A damaging tear to her left ventral mitral valve. And she was 39 years old at the time. And she was about 4 months pregnant with me when she discovered that she was having some heart issues, and it was a result of having, needing to have her mitral valve repaired. So, what she could have never have known is that while she was admitted to the hospital for probably what was supposed to be a week to 2 weeks in 1972 to have that type of surgery and then recover from it, that while she was recovering, Agnes occurred, and the entire town of Danville was essentially unreachable from the outside world. I mean, during the time of the active flooding, as the story was told to me, she should have been able to be discharged from the hospital and return home. Unfortunately, because every route 54, routes 11, all routes in and out of Danville were unpassable because of the floodwaters. I know that, my father tried to go on the day she was to be discharged, tried to go to the hospital and pick her up. And as he told the story, he was turned away by a state policeman because, when he asked, how do you get into Danville? The only response that he received was, you would have to have a boat to get in there. So I think it turned out that my mom was probably in the hospital a week longer than she would have needed to be. And essentially the moral of the story, if there is one, I believe that Mr. Roberts in a few minutes is going to confirm this for us. If an event similar to Agnes were to happen today, that likely would not be the case. And someone who is recovering from a pretty significant surgery wouldn't necessarily have to have their sheltering in place occur for quite as long or at all, because of because of what Danville has done for as so if you would, Andrea, if you could, the next slide.
We're on the next
Can you
slide.
just give me a thumbs up that you hear me?
Yeah, your connection is just started to go in and out. So
Maggie, can you give me a thumbs up that you can hear?
Now
Andrea,
I can.
if you could, the next slide. Hear me? Okay, great. Oh, thanks, Andrea. Oh, great. I think it might be my internet connection. Well, at any rate, my story with Danville made, I think, 1972 with Agnes, but certainly Danville's flooding history didn't end. It's been building over the last 50 years. I'm going to ask Crystal if she could come on camera and take the next slide, because not only, follow about 25 years, almost exactly following the events of Agnes, Danville was again impacted by now FEMA disaster 1093, which was a significant flooding event in 1996. And Crystal Newman, I believe, is still here with us, and she was the active project officer for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania during that time. And Crystal, if you would, I will hand off this slide to you.
Yes, good morning, all. So what an awesome story there, Dusty, about your mom back in Agnes. I was a project officer back in 96 and definitely wasn't around during Agnes, but we've been there quite a while. Dusty and I started back in early 1996, where we had one of the most major snowstorms in our region. Disaster 1093 was declared by the president. Totally remember that like it was yesterday. We had waist deep snow that, I mean, like everybody, a lot of snow melt and flooding in the residential areas. So as the PO for Pennsylvania, I think I reviewed hundreds of applications for similar projects that Dusty showed you up on the previous screen. One of the projects came from Danville Borough, Montour County, for a hydraulic raking system that was very unique in its kind, like one of the first ones. And we hemmed and we hauled over the project's eligibility, and was there any benefit to the government for doing such a project? And eventually we were able to approve the project and give Danville the money to do the project. So not to belabor, but it's so good to know that the project is the equipment is still being used today to I think to clean the debris out of the area to prevent flooding in the residential and in the borough. So yeah, it's good to know and good to see the fruits of our labor through the government HMGP program. So I'll hand it off to, I think, Danville to talk more about it.
Thank you, Crystal. Please excuse me for not having my video on due to unforeseen circumstances. I'm going to try to present from my pickup truck today. So Danville, Pennsylvania, as Dusty said, is located in central Pennsylvania. It's a borough of approximately 2 square miles that 6,000 residents call home. We are bordered to the south by the Susquehanna River and largely subdivided by Seckler Run, which runs from east to west and eventually dumping into the Mahoney Creek. The creek itself also subdivides the borough from north to south. There we go. As you can see by the flood insurance rate map in front of you, the residents of Danville are certainly no stranger to the word floodplain, as we do have the 1%, 0.2%, and if it wasn't for the existing levee system that we currently have uncertified, we would likely have a lot of floodway as well. The borough, unfortunately, through documented history, has been flooded some 15 times over the past 200 years, despite taking numerous steps to safeguard the residents from disaster. Half of those events, amazingly, have occurred over the last 70 years. The combination of being seated in the Susquehanna River with the rolling hills of Pennsylvania and having the major hurricane stall over the region absolutely created the perfect setting for a historic disaster in the borough, as well as all surrounding areas. That disaster, as you know, was named Agnes. The borough did have a partial earthen levee along the Susquehanna River prior to Agnes. That existing earthen levee led to a bit of a false sense of security by the residents living within the borough, as it had fought off earlier but much smaller flooding events. Agnes, as you know, was very different than those past flood events and to a much different scale. Without the completed levee system, Danville unfortunately had to learn a very hard lesson. Pictured is the Danville earthen levee system. Oh, there we go. That runs along the Susquehanna River that was largely in place at the time of Agnes. The levee has since been improved and now works in conjunction with several other mitigation projects to protect 628 homes and businesses within the borough. Next slide, please. After Agnes, many projects were undertaken through Fma grants and other state and federal funding sources. Shown in this picture is the concrete culvert that now guides Seckler Run through and under the borough. This project, starting at the borough boundaries, has a large debris rack that is very efficient at catching large debris such as trees, rocks, and so forth. The project also has a large debris rack near the borough pump station, which is located at the end of Seckler Run at the edge of the Mahoney Creek. Unfortunately, the culvert system itself is needing to be cleaned out annually due to the amount of sediment that collects within it. Currently, we're in discussions with some private property owners near the borough's edge in hopes that they will participate and create a sediment pond that could be more easily cleaned out and avoid the necessary cleanouts of the culvert system annually. Next slide, please. Both the Mahoney Creek and Seckler Run levee systems are the results of lessons learned from Agnes as the creeks overran their banks, and with the assistance of the earthen levee near the river, it turned the borough basically into a bowl, flooding several hundred homes and businesses in the process. To say that people were caught off guard will be an understatement, as our commercial district, our downtown business district, and in photos from the time, you can see people looking out of the second floor windows where they sought refuge. The entire flood mitigation system has recently undergone renovations to elevate the effective heights. The new height that has now been achieved is recorded at being 3 feet, hopefully, a freeboard above the 72 Agnes flood level. This level is believed to be effective for all flooding on record, and hopefully enough to withstand any future events that certainly will occur. Next slide, please. Shown here is the Seckler Run pump house that abuts the Mahoney Creek. The pump station was added in the 1980s, and then, as Dusty had mentioned, further renovated in the mid-90s to add what is known to many as the traveling rake or the hydro rake, pictured there in gray. That rake will completely roll to the left as about as far as you can see in the photo, and through automatic operation or manual control will remove any debris up and away from the massive metal grates at the entrance of the pump station. If you see the areas towards the bottom left of that slide, the brownish areas, those are all vertical grills, grates, if you will. And the rake actually will go down to the bottom of that. The tines will go between the grates and lift all the way up to the top, where it will then pull out the debris. After approximately 25 years of operation, the borough is now having the hydraulic lines replaced and one of the 3 generators repaired. The neat thing about this pump house and the rake is that in the event of a power outage, all generators obviously automatically kick on, and then the pump station computer begins calling a phone list, firstly notifying our flood technician and then moving on to other public works department officials, notifying them of its current status. The pump station is tested monthly by the borough's flood technician and will be the highlight of the Danville Borough 2023 Flood Awareness Week. Our flood technician is responsible for maintenance and testing of all flood mitigation structures within the borough, as well as maintenance of our levee system to include varmint control and so forth. A lesson learned from a more recent flood event provided us the needed insight to seek out and add the last of the commercial closures. And prior to the commercial closures, our system of handling flood events would be contacting the varsity sports teams, and they would come out and sandbag for us, and that would do a decent job at combating the flooding waters. The addition of the commercial closure projects was completed at all openings following the flooding caused by Tropical Storm Lee in 2011. During Lee, everything seemed to be going as planned until, unfortunately, the earth below a set of railroad tracks gave way and floodwaters came rushing into a small portion of the borough, which unfortunately contained our elementary school as well as a few businesses. Now that area and all others have since been repaired, and there is now concrete foundations poured from the bedrock on up until the area of the commercial closures. Next slide, please. The borough is patiently awaiting the certification of our flood mitigation system following the renovations that have been completed as recently as 2020. with a little bit of luck, FEMA will bless us with that certification. In the coming months ahead, we're looking to continue our mitigation journey through steps towards higher standards. One such step is a new and highly enforceable floodplain ordinance that will be requiring 3 feet of freeboard for new or substantially improved structures. And we're also adopting the 2021 building codes in regards to floodplain construction. This not only allows the structure to be more resilient to flooding, it also offers the owner of the building the highest level of savings in their flood insurance premiums. We are in the process of adding silt socks to our stormwater grates in an attempt to keep pollutants at bay and comply with Pennsylvania's MS4 requirements. And lastly, we are also in cooperation with Montour County. We are working on 2 projects currently. The first is the conversion of 8 acres of currently sodded ground, turning that into 8 acres of planted meadows that we are hoping should work to absorb more water than the grass would offer a deeper root system, and certainly work as a filter for the water that would eventually be added into the Chesapeake Bay watershed. The second project is in cooperation with both Montour County and CEDACOG. This is to complete the buyouts of the last of our unprotected homes within the borough. Next slide, please. The last item I wanted to discuss is the tools that are available to anyone who has access to a computer. If you're younger than a certain age and enjoy better eyesight than I do, you can probably figure out how to access this on your phone. If you go to the website shown on the slide, you can check the current and predicted river levels either under the hydrograph tab or by clicking on the current forecast circle on the top left corner of that slide shown there. You can then take that predicted level and click on it within the inundation mapping tab under inundation levels. This will be the area shown on the left side of the photo. Also on that same side, you will see record crest levels. Agnes is certainly on there. These numbers will give you a general idea within a foot or two as to where the water will likely be present at each flood stage. If you zoom in on the map and you point to where you can identify your home, you can click your home, and in doing so, a pin will be placed upon it. That pin would then generally pop up a message box that should give you what the expected water depth in that area during the flooding event would be. Certainly you can go to the left and again change the flood levels to see at what point would be reason for you to have concern. This tool can also be the difference between getting your loved ones and material possessions out of harm's way or potentially losing everything. Personally, I've been glued to this tool through numerous near flood events. Thankfully, no actual flood events to date. It saves me a great deal of time from going out and walking and driving and researching the water levels throughout the night. And that's all I have. If anybody has any questions for me.
Thank you so much, Ken. I really appreciate having the local perspective and a case study of a community that was very much impacted by Agnes, as Dusty said at the beginning. And I think it's also what you touched on at the end. You know, we've talked a lot about mitigation in terms of actual projects, but what we also saw after Agnes, and Stacy alluded to this, was the evolution of floodplain management through the Nfip. And I noticed that Frank Grumbine from the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office dropped a whole thesis about evaluating floodplain management before and after Tropical Storm Agnes. So I definitely encourage participants to take a look at that. I just wanted to say that this entire webinar is part of a much larger project I mentioned at the beginning, and there is a 50th anniversary of Hurricane Agnes website. And so if you go to that website, I dropped it in the chat earlier, and maybe one of my colleagues can drop the link again. You will see stories, videos of people and their experience, and then a lot of information about what we've done since Agnes in terms of mitigation, in terms of service improvements, and and what we can do moving forward. Next slide. There are 2 more webinars coming up and discussions. So one on June 21st, that's focused on the response to Agnes and how response has evolved over time to emergencies. That will include some speakers from FEMA and the National Weather Service and the Army Corps of Engineers, as well as survivors. And then the Agnes Reflection on Facebook, which is a live panel discussion on the 21st as well at 7 p.m. So mark your calendar for the 21st of June this month for more information and engagement around Agnes. It's noon now, so I understand that many folks may have to drop, but I am going to ask our panelists if they can stay on the line for just a few more minutes, and we can have a little bit of a discussion. I was curious from your perspective, what you think as a local practitioner has been the biggest evolution in how you've approached mitigation over time.
Well, I can say in the several years I've been doing this in multiple communities, I guess the evolution of the floodplain ordinances has been one of the largest tools in helping us seek that mitigation and compliance, willingness to work with their homes and businesses to avoid future flooding. Certainly the improvement of the building codes has been a huge asset, and ideally just ongoing education through yourself and other entities have been very powerful.
Yeah, I think what you said there kind of reflects, Stacy, what you said at the beginning about how some of the Army Corps' work has evolved over time as well. I'm curious your answer to the same question. What do you think has been kind of the biggest evolution since Agnes in how the Corps has approached flood risk management?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, we were definitely doing more structural solutions, levees, dams, now trying to look more natural and nature-based. I think one of the biggest challenges, right now is really working with communities to find solutions that we can all agree on. I think some communities are more receptive to a levee flood wall. Some typically, like coastal areas, don't want the wall. They want more natural, nature-based. Sometimes you can't really get the level of protection that you would like. So I really think it's just trying to balance all of these different types of solutions, and then also what meets your requirements. The Corps actually, has requirements. We have a benefit cost ratio that we must meet. It's always been heavily based on economic damages, which of course doesn't really assist disadvantaged communities, and that's an area where the Corps and the federal government, particularly, are looking to try to help disadvantaged communities. So I think the Corps is, looking for ways that we can start to do that more, and also the other benefits, adding in the recreation. We've always been able to address those, but they haven't really gone into our benefit cost ratio. So I know that's something that's in guidance that's being developed by the Corps of how to both assist disadvantaged communities and try to look at all those different benefits.
Stacy, you mentioned briefly on kind of coastal protection. Agnes really was an interior storm in terms of the amount of damage that most of the areas in Region 3 suffered. But we did have a question earlier about kind of mitigation along the coast. I didn't know if you could speak to a few strategies that you've seen.
Yeah, you're right. I didn't touch on coastal because Agnes was here more inland, but yes, I mean, obviously the Corps and communities up and down the East Coast and in the Bay are dealing with coastal flooding and nuisance flooding and sea level rise. They've got the additional, issue of sea level rise that will just increase the day-to-day flood level. So again, I think it's something we're struggling with. I think, again, we're looking at things such as living levees, living shorelines, maybe some flood walls. I know Norfolk District, they're looking in the city of Norfolk. I know Miami's looking at it. New York has a number of projects. I'm not personally involved in any of those at this time, but But I'm actually working with the city of Cambridge in Maryland. It's not a core project, it's their own, but a number of us are advising, and they're looking at really some types of living levees, living shorelines, so they can have like lower levees, but with wetlands and, more environmentally friendly type solutions, but they're not, they don't want a high wall. So those are some of the things that we're looking at.
I see that John just posted in the chat that apparently there's a glass flood wall that Charleston, South Carolina is looking at to maintain views. Stacy and I exchanged an email earlier this morning about that same question in the Norfolk area about how, people want to be around the water. That's where all of our communities have grown up for economic reasons, because it's a great resource. And really, how do we balance living with water, making space for water, and being protected from what it really can do. So Dusty and Crystal, just gonna wrap it up with you. You mentioned the influx of funding that we've seen in the hazard mitigation assistance grant programs. That's really, really historic. So where do you see the direction, at least from FEMA's perspective, going in the future? What kinds of different sort of projects are we looking to fund? What kind of innovative applications have you seen from our state and local partners?
Sure. Crystal, if you don't mind, I'll take the first stab at that. Then if you have anything to add, please jump in. No, I mean, you really captured it, Maggie. It is the increase in the investment opportunities that FEMA is providing. It really started with the introduction of the BRIC program, which came out of some 2018 legislation in the DRRA, or the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, just making more money for mitigation available pre-disaster, rather than, again, having to be subject to an event first and then coming on behind the declaration with funding. So that was the first iteration, and the current administration has just broadened that opportunity by not only the level of the response to the COVID pandemic on the disaster side, but also expanding project types and promoting project types that start with community resilience through BRIC, and looking at really assessing how we're making funding decisions and investment decisions at the community level, and by applying like an equity lens to all of the decisions. So one thing that I didn't mention in my we
just started to lose Dusty there. Crystal, I didn't know if there's anything you wanted to add.
Well, just similar to what he's already said, like, FEMA has recognized the difficulty in coming up with unique projects that, address the flooding issues out there in the state and local. So they have implemented a lot of efforts to assist with coming up with different projects, and assisting with the benefit cost analysis, because that's a heavy lift down at the local level. So they come up with predetermined benefits, so that like a regular project, we already know what type of benefits to the government the project's going to bring. So there's no BCA needed. A lot of environmental work is done up front, to relieve some of the burdens down at the local level. And from us moving from the HMGP disaster to pre-disaster, as Dusty said, has really helped us out a lot, so we can address the issue before it becomes an issue. So we have a lot of pre-disaster, a lot of big projects. Like, we're doing a lot, and coming down from the headquarters level, and to try to assist the state and local with the difficult projects, scoping them out, provide technical assistance, try to figure it out, you know what I mean? Because it's not easy to figure out what to do to flooding that's going to be relentless when it wants to be, so yeah, we provide a lot of more assistance and understanding the difficulty, at the state and local level.
Great, thank you so much, Crystal, Dusty, Stacy, Ken, for joining us for this webinar. Andrea, can you just go to the last slide there? we'll end on this note. You know, there's still a lot to be learned from Agnes. This is part of our contribution to that conversation. Please help us share the stories, help us share the information that you've learned from practicing. And we have a lot of practitioners on this call who are doing this through their daily work. So help us to commemorate Agnes, and thank you all so much for joining us. We will post the webinar and I will email all of the registrants the link to the webinar when we have made it available. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.